Today, we're going to be looking at what is a weird soul and how do I become one by taking a look at Romans 12. So, here we go, weirdos. So, today, we're going to be getting into what is a weird soul and a little bit more of how faith and culture intersect. So, if you have looked at the Bible at all or heard sermons, different things, I'm sure you've heard a little bit about an upside down kingdom or that we are not meant to live a life what the world looks like, but the life Jesus showed us and demonstrated for us when he was on earth is a very backwards kind of life, aka weird soul life. So we're called to be in the world, not of the world. And I think a good place for us to start is looking at the Bible and the context it was written in, and then looking at how that translates in today's world. And that'll help us start understanding kind of where our faith and our culture intersect. So, first of all, one of the major parts of the Bible that helped me kind of decide this is what I wanted Weird Souls to be was Romans 12. And Romans 12 is just a great chapter on how do we live a Christian life. Some things that I want to talk about before we really get into what Romans 12 is talking about. First of all, is the understanding that at this time that Paul is writing, he's writing to the Roman church. It has already been established. It's not a church that Paul started, but one that somehow started through the other teachings of the disciples or Paul. And one of the people that heard from them wound up in Rome, and the church kind of got a start from that. He's also talking to a church that's divided. It is still very segmented between the Gentiles and the Jews, and people that are smart and study all the things about the Bible believe that the Gentiles in Rome were the stronger section of the church and kind of looked down on the Jews, where it was reversed in the Middle East area. Another thing to understand is, for the most part, it was fairly peaceful. There wasn't mass persecution happening in this time, but they were looked at as strange. Christians were. The Romans and really all the culture of that time, they were still a polytheistic society, so they believed in all the different gods. And so the Christians that were up and coming, it was seen as a new religion. It was seen cultish or superstitious. It seemed weird that they were looking at one God rather than multiple gods. They were just seemed as a weird little sect of people, but they didn't have a ton of power. They weren't doing anything that harmed or caused the current people in charge to be super concerned outside the Jews. And so, for the most part, the Christians weren't having a ton of persecution happening at this moment, especially since Saul had become Paul. The Bible even says that after Saul's transformation into Paul, the church experienced peace. There wasn't a ton of people against them. So, kind of similar to where we're at least American culture today. It's not like people are out to literally kill us, but we're seen as weird. People don't necessarily understand us. We can kind of be a fringe to our community sometimes. And so there's some similarities between what was happening in Bible times and what we're currently experiencing. So that leads us to Romans 12. And I like Romans 12 because it really just hits all the pieces of how we should actually do the faith thing. There's a lot of times I feel like talks and devotionals and things like that can be very inspirational, which is great, or very theological, which is also great. But sometimes we just want to know, how do I do the thing? How do I do this thing that we're supposed to? And Romans 12 is a really great starting point for this, I think. Now, I'm not going to read through Romans 12. It's linked below if you want to read that or grab your own Bible, read that. I recommend you read the NLT and the Message version because it just gives you a little bit, it just gives you two different viewpoints on how to live a weird soul kind of life. But we're actually going to break it down and we're going to look at it through relationships. The longer you're with me, the more you're going to hear that we look at everything through relationships, because that's the whole point of everything. God started all of this crazy world with relationship in mind. He's fixing it with relationship in mind. So we're going to look at a lot of things with relationship in mind. And there are three main relationships that everybody should have. We have our up relationship with God, we have our in relationship with other Christians, and then we have our out relationship with our community. And those are the three relationships that are really going to define how we act and interact with the people around us in our world and our culture. So we're going to start with our up relationship. And these are kind of the sections of Romans 12 that I pulled out as being very specific to our relationship with God. It says, give your bodies to God. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. It says, let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. It says, work hard and serve the Lord enthusiastically. Rejoice in our confident hope and keep on praying. So, in our up relationship with God, how we interact with Him, the first thing that Romans 12 lists out is that we are to give everything to God and be a living sacrifice. And when Paul's writing this, he's writing this from the viewpoint of somebody who grew up as a Jew, looking for the Messiah. He spent his whole life being dedicated to understanding Jewish scriptures, Jewish law, Jewish everything. So that's one of the reasons why Paul's able to go so quickly from being Jewish into Christian, is he had already spent his life studying all the scriptures. And when Jesus showed himself to Paul, it was kind of like a light bulb moment where everything just clicked into place and he understood everything he'd been studying to that moment. And so when he's talking about living sacrifice, he's doing it through the viewpoint of somebody who spent his whole life sacrificing. And there are lots of rules and regulations around how and when and what you sacrifice. And these sacrifices are what is a good aroma and an appeasement to God to set your sins forward until the time that the Messiah would come. So Paul spent his whole life doing all of these sacrifices, trying to appease God for the sin that he had done until the time the Messiah would come. And now, under the new law, he is using that same imagery, saying the way that we constantly were giving up the things that belong to us to God as reminders that it wasn't ours, it was God's. That's how we need to live our lives. Our whole body, everything about us is now a sacrifice to God. And that's the true way we worship. In the Old Testament, the true way of worship was sacrifices to God in order to say sorry for the sins that they either knew they committed or the sins that they didn't know that they committed. They were constantly giving sacrifices back to God as a reminder that he was in charge and that they belonged to him. And now we give our lives as living sacrifices, is what Paul calls it. So once we give our bodies and everything we do to God, we also need to give our minds to him and he will transform it. And it's this whole concept of the way we were before God is not the way we're supposed to be. Our sinful desires, our selfish desires for us are supposed to be transformed into God's desires. What does he want us to do? What does he want for our lives? There's this metamorphosis process that happens that we should be working towards achieving a mind that is in sync with God and giving up the way we used to think about life. Paul also shows that there's an understanding with our relationship with God that there's work that needs to be done. We're not supposed to just sit around and read and study our Bible all day long. We have work to do. And not just ministry work, but all of our work. We can't remove ourselves from the world and from the things that have to be done, even though we would all love to not have to adult anymore. There is this understanding that everything we do can be an act of worship to God. And when we work as though we're working for the Lord, that shows people a different kind of life and a different understanding for the everyday boring pieces, but that they can be used as worship to God. And then he reminds us to continually pray. Paul brings this up multiple times through all of his letters, but there's a constant communication that needs to be happening with God, that we need to be constantly going to him and giving him our worries and our wants and our desires and everything that we are hoping for. We constantly need to be praying that God is going to meet us where we are and help us get to what is next. And then we rejoice in our confident hope being Jesus. We know and hope for Jesus to come back, and we can rejoice in that regardless of the circumstances. And so all through this chapter, Paul is helping the Romans understand what a healthy relationship with God and what that mindset is, especially since it's believed the majority of the Roman church were Gentiles, which wouldn't have studied the Old Testament scriptures and wouldn't have had a clear understanding of what Jesus as the Messiah actually meant, especially for the Jewish Christians in that church. Which leads us to our in relationships, our relationships with other Christians. And these are the things Paul listed out in the chapter as how we need to treat each other that call ourselves Christians within the church. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves, measuring yourselves by the faith God has given us. Love each other with genuine affection. Take delight in honoring each other. When God's people are in need, be ready to help them. Always be eager to practice hospitality. And so these just give us a general outline of how we are to treat each other within the church, because the reality is, if we aren't treating each other well within the church, who's going to want to join? Like, nobody wants to join a Hot Mess Express. And that's part of how we're different. We show people what it is really supposed to be like by the way we treat other people within the church. And it's supposed to be that when we're doing this correctly, people are intrigued and they're like, I would like to be a part of a community like that. It looks like you really take care of each other. And that's what brings people into being interested in a relationship with Jesus, as they see how we're supposed to be. They see that we're weird and that we're different than the way the world says we should be, which is take care of yourself, get what's owed you, all of those kinds of things. Instead, we lift each other up and we're unified. And so that's supposed to be attractional. So one of the first thing he says that Paul says about our relationships with each other is making sure that we have a right view of ourselves. We can't be looking at ourselves as higher up or more important than others. We can't think that because we're doing something in the church that makes us better than other people. It's having a clear understanding that we each have a job to play, and it doesn't matter what that job is. All of the roles that we have within the church work together for ultimately the glory of the church as a whole and God. And so once we've set our mindset right on where our position is in the church, then our job is to love each other. And again, this is an agape kind of love. This is sacrificial love. This is doing the best for somebody. This isn't the other types of love that we often have one word for in English, but they have many types of words for in Greek. But we're supposed to love each other and we're supposed to honor each other, which means calling people out for the good that they're doing, encouraging them, helping them be the best version of themselves in the community of believers. And that also means taking care of each other. We're supposed to make sure that nobody within our church family is in need. And this can be difficult when you, especially when you start getting into bigger churches. This, I think, is one of the benefits of smaller churches. All sizes have their benefits and their drawbacks. But the benefit of smaller communities is it's easier to know what needs truly are and help people with those needs. The bigger church gets, the more, just the longer time it takes and the more clarifications you have to have, because the relationship isn't there to really understand the need. And that's why benevolence can be difficult at larger churches. But at smaller churches, or in smaller communities, like small groups for larger churches, it's easier for people to just be like, oh, you need this, I'm going to take care of it. So regardless of the size church you go to, you as an individual are being called to help those that you see around you with need in your church community. So it might be your small group, it might be your serving team, it might be people that you serve through your serving team. It might be from a church-wide perspective of helping other people and being collaborative. But the goal is that nobody in your church community has need, so that people see that. Again, it's an attractional quality that people see, oh, you're taking care of the people that you call yours. They're a part of your community. You're claiming them as a part of your community and you're making sure they're taken care of. That's different. I like that. I'm interested. And so by doing this, by taking care of each other, by having humility and understanding that each of us play a role and not thinking of ourselves as higher up than another, all of these things become attractional in the way we treat each other for people outside our community. And the weird way we treat each other in the community doesn't stop at the community. Once we are unified and acting the way Jesus has showed us to act amongst each other, we take that out into the world and we give people a taste of what that's supposed to look like. Here is what Romans 12 says about our relationships out or with our community. It says, really love others. Bless those who persecute you. Pray that God will bless them, the people that persecute you. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. And in these things that are specifically to us on how we relate to people outside in our community, this is where the weird souls piece really dials up. Because it's one thing to treat the people that are in agreement with you well. It's one thing to treat the community that has said, we're all in with you on the same viewpoint and mentality. That's easier to be unified and treat each other well and with love. But when you go outside of your community, when we're outside the church and we're still treating people well, and in fact treating them the opposite way that the world would say we should treat them, that is weird. That is something that throws people off and makes it even more interesting what we're doing. So we're to treat others. We're to treat people that treat us terribly, that persecute us, that do not treat us well with blessings. We're supposed to help those that treat us poorly. And I've heard tons of stories about people who help those that are making their lives terrible. And in the end, they win them to Christ because they're like, there is zero reason why you should be treating me well, and yet you are. I'm interested in this person that you're talking about, Jesus, because he's telling you to act in a way that completely makes no sense. And so we're supposed to bless them. We're supposed to pray that God blesses their life, even though we may not want to ask God to make the mean people have good lives. But that is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to ask and show blessing to people and show them how it's supposed to be, in the hopes that when they see a better way of life, they're like, that's the life I actually want. I want this life that we treat each other well and things go well for us and that we're blessing each other and people don't have need. That's the life that I want. And it just drives the point home with giving your enemies food and drink, because in that time they were living in, well, Romans weren't necessarily living in a desert culture, but in Paul's area in the Middle East, it was a desert culture, but there still wasn't a middle class. Like there were a lot of people that didn't have what they needed. And that was one of the benefits of the church, is everybody was helping with everything. So the rich were helping with the poor could help with skills and labor and things like that. And just everything worked well together. So when Paul is calling people to share food and water with our enemies, he's calling on people that didn't necessarily have enough for themselves to share with people that didn't treat them well, that might have had what they needed on more regular basis. But he's saying, even when you don't have everything you need, you still need to share with the people that are treating you poorly, because that's us trusting God is going to take care of us. And that's you showing them, not only do I believe God is going to take care of me, but you can have some of this. This is what it tastes like. This is what our community is like. And people wanted to join that. And then the last couple things that kind of go for either, like it didn't seem like these were specific to an in or an out relationship. These were the last couple things that it's like, it doesn't matter who they are. You're gonna do this. Be happy with those who are happy. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with each other. Hold tightly to what is good. Be patient in trouble. Do things in such a way that everyone can see you are honorable. Do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Conquer evil by doing good. And that last phrase, conquer evil by doing good, like that just sums it all up. We overcome difficulties in this world, and we overcome what the world says is how we should act, by doing good, by showing people how life could be, by showing people a better way of life. And so he's just reiterating, we need to hold on to good. We need to be patient. We need to experience life with people and not just kind of avoid it. And especially with American culture, I don't know if it's this way in other cultures necessarily. I think some do mourning better, but we definitely, as American Christians, avoid some of the hard things of life. We'd rather focus on the joy and the hope and the happiness of Jesus and the church. But when people have difficulties, when they're struggling, when they're mourning over bad things that happen in their life, we're not always the best at sitting with those people and being with them in that moment and saying, I know this is terrible, but it will get better. And that's an area I think we definitely can work on. That's part of why I went with the weird souls angle and a little bit of a darker side of things, because I don't want us to shy away in our conversations from some of the harder topics, some of the things that feel darker to us than the happy, bright, joyful things that we like to focus on. So to be a weird soul, you're there in the hard times as well as the happy times. You're going to be there for somebody regardless of what they're going through. And that's how we build community and relationship. Now, in addition to all the things we are supposed to do, Paul also listed some things that we should not do. In our out relationships, we're not to copy the behavior and customs of this world. Don't curse them, the people who persecute you. And I think those are two really good things that sometimes we get a little gray on in the church world. And sometimes it can be hard. That's why we're going to be talking about all things of faith and culture and life. But don't mimic the world. Sometimes we think we have to be like the world for them to be interested in what we're selling, but that is not at all the way to think about our faith. We are attractional because we're different than them. And when we start acting like the world, thinking they'll be interested in what we have, we're no different than them. So they think we have nothing different than them to offer. And so the important thing with it goes along with transforming your mind. We have to be different than them, and not in a mean way, not in a you're doing it wrong way. We don't want to judge them and say you're doing life wrong, you have to do it our way, because they never signed up for our way of life. But we can say, hey, I'm trying something different. I'm doing life in a different way, and this is all the good that a different way of life offers. Do you think you're interested in this? That's the attractional way of bringing people in and not mimicking them, still being around them, still being in that world, showing them that there is a different option for how we live life, and leaving it up to them on whether or not they want to join in or not. But we have to keep some of the differentiation between how we live our life and how the world lives our life. And then with all relationships, Paul says, don't think you are better than you really are. We've talked about that. Never be lazy. Don't be too proud to enjoy the company of ordinary people. Don't think you know it all. Don't pretend to love others. Don't pay back evil with more evil. Don't take revenge. And don't let evil conquer you. And this is a lot of what we've already talked about. It's just the inverse. Like, don't do these things. And I think sometimes it's good not just to look at what we should do, but also look at what we don't want to do. Because sometimes it's easier to see, oh, I am caring about the hierarchy of who I'm hanging out with, or oh, I am treating people the way they treat me rather than treating them the way I want to be treated. And so sometimes looking at the negative helps us identify when we're acting that way so that we can lean into the positive. So that's kind of the understanding behind weird souls and what it takes to be a weird soul. Obviously, the Bible talks a lot about the different ways we're supposed to live. We're going to get into all of those different things over our course and journey here at Weird Souls. But Romans 12 is really where I started. It also gets into some of our spiritual giftings and how we're supposed to contribute our gifts to the body, the church body. But I decided I want to save spiritual gifts for its own little section because Paul does talk about this a lot and there's a lot of different thoughts about it. So we're going to get into spiritual gifts on its own at some other point, but give Romans 12 a read this week or today even, and start looking at how do I get to be a little bit more weirder in a way that makes somebody say, I think that's the life that I'm interested in, or tell me more about this because that's weird, but it's good weird. And I think that might be a better way of living life. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Weird Souls Are We. Make sure to hit that like button and hit the subscribe so you never miss a video. We'll see you next time.